Falcha, you're welcome, everybody. Hello. Fair play to you for all being here so early. I'm told Paddy has been a very good taskmaster in getting everybody on the bus, so it's a good start. It's a good start to the day. So yes, fitting on the summer solstice that we're having. Somebody took me to task last night and said today is not the summer solstice; it's the 21st, but it is because it's a leap year. So there you are. So it's the year you can propose to a new partner as well. So I hope those that were there last night had a good night and a good sleep. For those new coming here this morning, you're very welcome to the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies. My name is Liam Campbell. I'm the director here, and we hope we have a few very good days. I'm sorry the sun isn't shining, but I think it might peek out a bit later. So the proceedings are we have a fairly tight schedule. Anybody has looked at the programme? Maybe we're too ambitious fitting it in. So I will be very schoolmasterish. I have these here. 1 minute, time up, to go. I'm looking for an old school bell from the schoolhouse to ring, and then there will be thunderclaps, so anybody goes over. So don't take it personal if I'm cutting people down. But anyway, just before that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Paddy Fitzgerald, who is Head of Research and Development here, just to do our housekeeping, which is very important to health and safety and all of that. Okay, Paddy.
Thank you, Liam. I think it's very ironic. Christine Johnson, the former librarian, would smile at the thought of me doing the housekeeping. But enough said on that. Basically, just to say, toilets, restrooms, through the double doors, into that short corridor. We're not expecting any drills or alarms to go off. If they do, there is a fire exit at the back and a fire exit at the front. Simply go through those fire exits, follow me and Liam, and we'll assemble in front of the reception of the folk park. If you have a mobile phone, could you please either turn it off or switch it to silent. The proceedings are being recorded today by Ronan, and if you have any issues in that, I know we've had communication with almost everybody, but if you have an issue with it, talk to either me or Liam. As Liam has said, it's a very tight schedule. We will be very strict on the 20 minutes, and we have to try and keep on schedule. Just to point out that we won't take questions immediately after the presentations, each individual presentation, but rather once the 3 or 4 presenters have presented, we hope there's time there for a collective Q&A. So, look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you, Paddy. And I'd just like to ask our chair of the Scots-Irish Trust, who is our main sponsor. The Mellon Centre for Migration Studies is the main project of the Scots-Irish Trust of Ulster. And our chair is John Gilmore, who I have to say has been such a support personally and every way, and even having this going and goes back a very long time to the instigation of this. He's quietly in the background, but he's always extremely supportive. Last night, I think he set the tone for it. So just for those who weren't there last night, I'd like to ask John to come forward just to give a bit of a welcome to everybody else. John.
Well, good morning and welcome everybody. I just can't believe that we have, how many people? 40 plus?
I was 60.
After the hiatus of the last few years, it was 2016 when the conference last met in the Ulster American Folk Park, and then we were in Toronto, and then in 2022 it was in Tennessee, East Tennessee, where it was very well organised by Professor Ron Loach and Dr. Jane McMorran from the University of East Tennessee. And of course the valiant Dr. Liam Campbell chaired nearly every session, and we watched him from a distance and in great admiration. But Tennessee left me puzzled, and with a very big question, which I'm asking you: who are the Scots Irish? I'm chairman of the Scotch Irish Trust, your main sponsor. In East Tennessee, I was left wondering why every speaker, including the American historians, talked about the Scots-Irish. Even Liam Campbell, who should have known better, we employ him. Because a century after the Ulster plantation, they were neither Scots nor Irish. They were a distinct ethnic group who, after more than 100 years living here, began to emigrate in significant numbers to colonial and post-colonial America, where they became known as the Scotch-Irish. James C. Leyburn, in his book The Scotch-Irish, in his introduction, writes, "The term Scotch-Irish is an Americanism, generally unknown in Scotland or Ireland and rarely used by British historians. An American usage that refers to the people of Scottish descent who, having lived for a time in the north of Ireland, migrated in considerable numbers to the American colonies in the 18th century." In 2001, Paddy Fitzgerald and Steve Eckeringill published a selection of papers from previous symposia. In their introduction to Atlantic Crossroads, it was entitled, they wrote, "Perhaps most obviously, the very term Scotch-Irish," Scotch-Irish, much in evidence at every meeting of the symposium, is a usage that has engendered controversy. I didn't set out today to be controversial, but apologies, I just had to get this issue off my chest. Besides, it's hardly relevant to this meeting of the symposium, where the focus is on the how rather than on the settlement in America. Liam and Paddy have worked tirelessly. They've assembled an excellent panel of speakers for us to enjoy over the next 2 days. One thing I mentioned last night, and I would ask you and remind you once again, don't forget to consider the 50th anniversary of the symposium and the 50th anniversary of the Folk Park, and to plan for 2026. I think I gave the impression last night that I'd never been to America, but I've travelled extensively in Canada and the USA, but I think what I said last night was that I'd only ever been to the symposium on the other side of the Atlantic once, and that was in Canada in 2022. But maybe when we rethink about the symposium for 2026, I may be allowed another opportunity to go to America to the symposium. But thank you so much, and welcome everybody this morning. We hope you enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much, John. And yes, it's a subject for debate, so you can discuss that tonight in a little rural pub in County Tyrone. But it is an interesting discussion. And ironically enough, our next is an overview of leaving Derry Port and Derry, London Derry. Derry has a lot of names as well. London Derry, Derry Calga. So we live in a place where names, even the word Ulster, what do we mean by Ulster? What do we mean Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland? So that's where we live, and that's what we do as people, as academics and people interested in local and family history, is discuss these things, and we do it in a very open and respectful way. So thank you very much, John, for that and for your continued support. So hopefully you won't hear much of me after this session, but I'm chairing this session, and I suppose it's very it's a broad title across the broad Atlantic, the how, but our first speaker is Brian Mitchell. I've known Brian for a very long time, and I can't think of anyone who can speak of leaving the port of Derry, London Derry better than Brian. He has dedicated his entire life to the study of that. He is so generous with his time, with people that come, with phone calls that he gets, and he's just an incredibly knowledgeable but also a very generous person. So I'd like to call Brian to the podium to do his piece on an overview of leaving Derry Port. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you very much, Liam. And now I know I think it was Paddy said in a previous talk that this was the first time he'd met somebody who uses more slides in a PowerPoint than he does. And I apologise in advance, and I suspect Liam will be showing me that time's up pretty quickly. But I mean, I've got to be honest, my overview of leaving Derry comes from spending 42 years as a family historian, first with Derry Inner City Trust and then contracted to Derry City and Strabane District Council. And over the years, the most interesting part of the day was when you met a new visitor and they had a new story to tell. And a former boss of mine said you should never let facts get in the way of a good story. So hopefully I'm going to whiz through an overview. There's a lot of slides here. Hopefully I'll get through them. In my view, certainly in Derry, there was 3 phases of immigration to North America. On sailing ships up to about 1820, direct from Irish ports. And then in that period in 1820 to 1860, on sailing ships from Liverpool. I was always amazed at that statistic that I read somewhere that in the famine period, 74% of the Irish left from Liverpool. They didn't leave from an Irish port. They maybe got in a steamer in Derry or what have you. And then from 1860 to 1960, Derry and Queenstown, which was to become Cove, were the 2 big immigration ports. And in fact, if you lived north of Sligo, Dublin, you tended to go out through Derry, and if you lived south of it, you went out through Cove or Queenstown. There's a picture of Derry that before the bridge was built, it was a departure point for immigrants from the Foyle Valley. And as early as 1680, you had people heading from Derry to Maryland in particular. I mean, the ancestors of James Knox Polk are supposedly from the Lifford area and left from Derry in about 1680. There's a picture of the McCorkle fleet of ships in 1881 tied up outside their mill in the heart of Derry. I'm a firm believer that, in listening to all these stories, that quite often I'm thinking people in the States know more about their family history than you're ever going to be able to prove from records held in Ireland. And this was a good example of it. That, I mean, the Presbyterian Church registers or baptism registers at Tobermore don't begin until 1860. But here's a certificate that went with the immigrant to a William Espy to America in 1774. And it just simply says, "We whose names are subscribed do hereby certify that William Espy, son of Hugh Espy of Tobermore in the parish of Kilcrona in County Londonderry, Ireland." And that's everything you need for family history. I mean, the number of times I get people who send, my ancestor's Paddy Doherty from Ireland, can you find him? And I'm thinking, no. So that was a certificate, and so that was dated 1774. So we know William immigrated about 1774. James Whiteside was the minister of Tobermore Presbyterian Church. So effective, you know that if their descendants were coming to Ireland, they could go to Tobermore and they'd be in the ancestral parish, as it were. We're probably all familiar with this map of the east coast of North America and the settlement of the Ulster Scots. I mean, in that period, initially the immigration was into through Boston. So in the period, in David Dobson's book, he identifies 47 ships that sailed to New England from Ireland. And one of these was the Elizabeth. Captain Robert Holmes arrived in Hull, which is in a peninsula in the Boston Harbour, from Ireland with 100 passengers on the 3rd of November 1719. And that came from David Dobson's book. And then the Minute Books of Boston, we've got a record there. Strangers lately come into the town of Boston, who by the appointment of the selectmen, which is the corporation really, whereby Mr. John Marion warned to depart. So you have 30 names there, including Robert Doak and I think Abraham Holmes. And then in Londonderry, New Hampshire, Robert Doak turns up here and Abraham Holmes here. Well, that's one of the earliest maps of Nutfield, which was become Londonderry, New Hampshire in 1722. It's an archive that, I mean, I've got to be honest, I've learned a lot from the people I've met over the years. And people, I mean, Liam very kindly said I'm generous in sharing information, but this partly comes from the fact that people have been very generous in sharing information with me. And it was a fellow doing research on the John Stamp, which was a ship that sailed from Derry to Philadelphia in 1832. he pointed me in the direction of the DuPont Company and the Brandywine Archive in the Hagley Museum. And they produced this lovely wee booklet, the DuPont Company and Irish Immigration, a study of the company's efforts to arrange passages for families of its workforce. And this says that London to Philadelphia was the oldest Irish immigrant trade route. And I mean, there is absolutely no doubt in that period, literally 1720 to 1815, people from the departing through Derry, their preferred destination was Philadelphia. And that's where the merchants of Derry wanted to trade with too, because flaxseed was being brought in from Philadelphia and linen and passengers were in the return voyage. And in that great book by Richard McMaster on Scotch-Irish merchants, there was at least 12 merchants in Derry in 1770s that owned ships involved in the transatlantic trade. It really was a massive trade. And this was a lovely booklet that Donegal County Council produced, just show all the northwest place names in Pennsylvania. So there's actually, I think if I remember rightly, there's in Pennsylvania there's 3 townships called Derry, or Londonderry, no, 3 called Londonderry, 5 called Derry, 4 called Donegal, 4 called Tyrone. And I mean, then you have your Strabans and your Milfords, and so
they're equally important to Strabane. Don't be putting Strabane out.
Oh no, and migration stories. I mean, as I say, I mean, this for me sums up the Scots-Irish or the Scotch-Irish or the Ulster Scots story. This here's the original tombstone in Rowan County, North Carolina, of Samuel Hillis. Now you notice here, and when they did the later erection of this monument, they put born in Scotland, August the 7th, 1707. I always love how people have such exact dates for that time period, because and then Peter from New York, this was a fellow I met in 2017. He was following the migration path of his ancestors through the Appalachian Mountains to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, to Derry, and then on into Scotland. So he was 6 weeks in northern. He spent a lot of it in Derry. And so his story is, and this is the Ulster Scots story. I live in the States and have Ulster Scots ancestors. The Hillhouses, Samuel Hillhouse, born in 1707, was from Limavady, not Scotland, and came to America as a young man. His parents were John and Rachel. They had a house estate called Freehall, which I could take you to outside Limavady. In America, the family name was changed to Hillis, although Sam signed as well Hillhouse. His grandfather Abraham came from Failford, Ayrshire, Scotland. Samuel landed at Newcastle, Delaware, then a part of the province of Pennsylvania, worked their way west to Chester and Lancaster counties, where there was cheap land and religious freedom. My people were there in the 1750s according to tax lists, and then took the Great Wagon Road to Rowan County, North Carolina, I've gone the wrong, but I've moved on. There we are. To North Carolina, and later, and so that's Rowan County, North Carolina, and later to Kentucky and Tennessee, where my mother was born. So, I mean, he's effectively followed the Scots-Irish story from Scotland through Ulster to America, into the frontier, and down into Kentucky and Tennessee. And then for 4 years, I think Christine of the library would have been well aware of Harry Wenzel of Harleysville, Pennsylvania. He spent 4 years researching the story of the ship Faithful Steward, which sank within 100 yards of the Delaware coast in 1785. And I first heard of this story in 1994. I came down to the Ulster American Folk Park and used that microfilm reader there to look through the Derry Journal of the 1780s to get this story. And the Faithful Steward sailed from Derry with 249 passengers, a cargo of linen, barrels of coins. It sank within 100 yards of the Delaware coast because I think they mistook the Indian River Bay inlet for the Delaware, and they were beached and wrecked, and only, I think, 181 people perished on that voyage. But so the ship went down on the 1st of September 1785, and The first reporting of the incident was in the Derry Journal of the 15th of November 1785. So 10 weeks after the sinking, that's when the people in Derry heard this ship had gone down. And then it was in February 1786 before the list of survivors was published in the Derry Journal. And I shared with Harry my knowledge from looking through the Derry Journal and the Belfast newsletter, from research that I'd carried out in 1994, because in Delaware there's a Dale Clifton who's opened a sea ship, Discover Sea Wreck Museum or something. I can't remember what his full title, but he's got a lot of the coins that came, copper coins that came off this ship, because this was before the US had a mint, and they think these were probably for small circulation coins. So a lot of these people, they reckon Gustavus Cahoon and Thomas Cahoon were from Newton Stewart, and were the people involved in bringing the copper coins over. There's been survival stories identified regarding the McIntyres and the Lees and the Elliots, and Harry identified, I think it was 20 descendants of survivors of this shipwreck, and he knows them, and he's been building up his knowledge. But you know, in research you can have a bit of luck, because in looking through the Derry Journal in the 1785, this letter was actually microfilmed in among the pages. And what it is, this Duncan Campbell Lee had visited Derry in July 1933. He had met William Maxwell Scott Moore of Mullennan, one of the big families in Derry. He said in the spare time he would look through the Derry Journal to see if he could find out further information about the story. But really, this is another aspect of how the Scotch-Irish went as communities and as families to the States, or to the colonies. So in this voyage, he was accompanied, so James Lee, an ancestor of a considerable important families of Lees in the United States, he was accompanied by his parents, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, a brother's wife, 3 uncles, 3 aunts and 33 cousins. And all 48 of the Lee... Oh, jeez. I better get going. And then in 1815, of course, migration had continued. So the destination shifted a wee bit. Philadelphia was still very important, but St. John, New Brunswick started to rival, certainly in terms of immigrants departing from Derry. There's the Johnville picnic and the Gormley clan, because every year in Canada, near Johnville in New Brunswick, families come back to celebrate their roots. I love this story of migration story of Francis Wall. He met his, he settled in Pennsylvania. He then sold his land in Pennsylvania to the railroad for a fortune, then moved to Kentucky. He was a colourful character. Supposedly he walked 80 kilometres from the cities of Louisville to Springfield, Kentucky, until a spot looked enough like Ireland to appeal to him. He found a land auction, then took the cash from under his hat, and he bought his property there. I love that wee poem. It was written by a Dave McMurdy, just showing the pull of the homeland for first generation migrants. So these were, it just clearly shows there was a very strong Protestant settlement in Ballachy at the turn of the 20th century. And he's remembering all the places of his childhood, like Palmer's Hill, the Shilling Hill and the famous Jean Bell's Well, the Barrack Hall and the King's William Street, Orange Hall. And then it goes over, there were McIntyres and Martins, Milligans and Brown, McWhinneys and McMurdy's always at their post. And really he would have loved, this was written in 1943. Passenger departure lists, I think they very much show that that Derry was very much the catchment area for the peoples of Derry, Donegal and Tyrone would have very much immigrated through Derry. But in the age of the steamships, it changed in that liners from Liverpool and Glasgow berthed at Moville, 20 miles downstream, or 18 miles downstream from Derry. And these tenders brought the immigrants or migrants from Derry down to Moville. And the railways had an important part in bringing people into Derry from, as I say, from Sligo, Dublin north to Derry. Like every village in Ireland had an agent, and this was the very prosperous looking P.J. Smith of Castleblaney, arriving in Derry with a group of immigrants from the Cavan Monaghan area. They would have stayed in boarding houses, for example, in Bridge Street. You had the Canadian Hotel and the Metropole here. There's the transatlantic tender shed, literally where Foyleside Roundabout is nowadays, so you have to have a good imagination. There's the boat heading downstream. I don't think you'll be allowed that many people on the boat today. Immigrants leaving Derry Quay. I'm arriving on the liner. Let's see. And I love this wee image here. It's of Joan Markey, age 2, and she was travelling alone to Brooklyn, New York, to join her parents in 1938. And the reason I know that is because I trawled through the Derry Standards from 1927 to 1939 to identify as many immigration photographs as I could. And there it is, Joan Markey, Derry, age 2 years, who is travelling alone to join her parents in Brooklyn, New York, photographing the anchor line with her doll and her wee bag. She was, passenger list showed she was visiting 107 Foyle Street, which was the home of Grace Duffy, her aunt. And then out of the blue, 4 years ago, I got a letter from a David in Southampton. His father was born in Cardiff, served in Derry during World War II, married a local girl who was a Duffy. He viewed my book I did in collaboration with the Library's NI of the Bigger MacDonald collection of photographs, and he said on page 46, couldn't believe my eyes, there's a picture of my cousin, this girl here. And in 2019 she was still living in St. Petersburg, Florida, and needless to say David sent her a copy of the book. And I, you know, but I'll finish there because I'm sure my time's up.
You've got a minute. We'll give you a minute.
Well, I'll finish with this one slide. I mean, 1939, Derry finished. The liners didn't come back to Derry, but through the 40s, or sorry, I should say, the 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s, if you were from Derry, you went to Cove to emigrate. So I remember one day in the office in the Craft Village. This lady, Mary Cunningham from Killybegs, walked in and she handed me this menu card from the Sylvania. And the story there was that she got married on the 30th of June 1964. The day after, they then got on the train to Dublin, then to Cove, and then on the 1st of July they boarded this ship at Queenstown, or Cove I should say, and then they arrived in New York 7 days later. So the story... no, I will finish there because...
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I really put you... You know, yes, you're getting very good at it, I'll tell you, to get through so many slides. How comprehensive and to get a real feel of place and people. And you know, that little girl is our... Mark is on our if you take our little flyer, and you know, it's a very evocative image of a young girl, and you did so much work about that as well. So yes. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. William Roulston, who is research director at the Ulster Historical Foundation, and a very good friend and supporter of the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies. We do a lot of work together. I always say William is doubly qualified, or even more than that. He's an archaeologist and a historian, and he blends the two of them together very seamlessly in a lot of work that we do together. And we recently we published a book on Lough Neagh, and it was a pleasure working with him. He is very incredibly prolific. There are a lot of publications. This is the plug. The Ulster Historical Foundation are selling books there if anybody's interested, and quite a few of them are William's own works. I can't think of anybody. I don't know. He's a very good father to his son and daughter, but I don't know where, and a husband to his wife. I don't know where he gets the time to do all he does. So, William, I'd just like to ask you to come forward, please. And his story is. It's a personal story. It's a family story as well, which is actually really lovely. So, there we are, William. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is a great pleasure to be speaking here again at the Symposium. And I'd like to congratulate good friends Liam and Paddy for all the work that they have put into making the symposium possible. And it's great to follow on from Brian, actually, who has set things up so well for the rest of the symposium. Although, Brian, we've actually dressed identically. How did we manage that?
Oh, good God. It's actually sure. It must be the sale or somewhere.
Austin's of the Diamonds. Well, this symposium, to take from the, you might say, the prospectus that Liam and Paddy composed, to actually quote from it, the symposium addresses the question, how? The central theme evolves around how migrants accomplished the journey across the Atlantic Ocean. This includes ways of communication, the migration trade, logistics, and rituals of departure and arrival. And in this talk, what I want to do is to look at these through an exploration of the transatlantic voyages of my 3 times great uncle, John James, or Jack Elder. And I can do so because of the survival of his diaries. And this gives me the opportunity to give a plug to 2 great institutions. What we have is it calls it the epitome of diaries. It covers the years 1881 to 1898. And a copy of that is in Prony. It was deposited there, it seems, in the early 1950s by Jack's cousin called J.F. Caldwell, a solicitor in Belfast, to whom Jack had sent them. So they're in Prony in copy form, but even more usefully, a full transcription of the diaries is available on the DIPAM website, the Irish Emigration Database established by the Mellon Centre. So you can read in full his diary. Now, briefly and by way of background, the Elder family had been residents in East Donegal since the mid-17th century. They had emigrated from Scotland. They lived in the Burnfoot, Burt, Newton Cunningham area of Scotland. Now, when I spoke here last February, I looked at the story of Jack's father, Andrew, and his own experiences, including his own emigration experience. He spent a number of years in Australia himself before coming back home to farm. And not to go into this in any detail, but this just shows you Andrew's own family connections and the impact that immigration had on that. 2 of his brothers, John James and Oliver Mathewson, Elder, emigrated to Canada in that fateful year of 1847. However, both died soon after arriving. One of fever, one of dysentery. And the first news the family had of them was, the first news the family had of their arrival was actually of their passing. Now, born in 1859, Jack Elder was the oldest child of Andrew Elder and Hessie Thompson. He grew up at Ashgrove in a townland called Scotland in the Finn Valley of County Donegal near Castle Finn. And again, this slide, not to go into it in detail, but you can read it for yourself, shows the impact that immigration had on that particular family. In fact, of the children who reached the age of 26, only 1 stayed in Ireland. Jeannie, who was my great-great-grandmother. Now, there's no firm evidence that Jack ever seriously considered becoming a farmer. His father had a farm in Scotland, but Jack seems to have been interested in literature and books. He was very much involved, like his father, in the tenant right movement, in the Land League, and in liberal politics in Donegal. He was also a keen beekeeper. Now, the diary begins in 1881, and one of the earlier entries from the 16th of April concerns Jack's visit to Rafo Fair to sell cattle. And it's fascinating what he writes. He records that while he was at the fair, the postmaster, to quote from his diary, showed me how a telephone works. Heard voice from Derry whispering numbers 1 to 90. Now, some of you are old enough to remember the first time you switched on a computer or got a smartphone or whatever it might be, but imagine hearing a telephone for the first time. Now, Jack Elder made no fewer than 7 transatlantic voyages between 1886 and 1900. And by that stage, of course, as Brian has outlined, there were numerous, you might say, choices for how to cross the Atlantic. But for most people in this area, it was through the port of Derry, but specifically sailing from Moville, where the great liners from Glasgow and Liverpool and so on stopped to pick up passengers on the way to North America. We don't know why he decided to emigrate. He does not confide that to his diary, but he clearly made up his mind to do so by March 1886. And we can follow the steps that he took very clearly through the pages of his diary. So, on the 27th of March 1886, he sent out 20 circulars regarding the sale of his beehives. On the 30th of March, he booked an intermediate passage ticket on the steamship Peruvian, sailing to Halifax, Nova Scotia, paying £2 on account, which left a balance of £5 and 5 pence. On the same day, in Derry, that is the 30th of March, he bought an overcoat and a trunk. Now, on the 9th of April, he had some good news in the bee front because a Mr. R. of Strabane bought 6 stocks of his bees. As the date of departure drew closer, on the 14th of April, he sent out several farewell letters to his friends and family, and the next day paid a number of personal visits to say goodbye to his nearest and dearest. On the 16th, he boarded the Peruvian at Moville. Now, the voyage across the Atlantic was around 2,350 miles or thereabouts. But when he arrived in Halifax, he still had some way to go to his final destination. From Halifax, he travelled to Moncton, then to St John, there to Macadam, then Canterbury, and finally Debec, in all a journey of around 400 miles by train. Now, in reaching Debec, he sent a cable home to his family to tell them that he had arrived. Now, you think what he's able to do in 1886, you certainly couldn't have done it in 1826, immediately letting your family know that you had arrived. Debec, incidentally, is in western New Brunswick. It's only about 4 miles from the border with the United States. Now, that he should have chosen this area for his new home was not at all surprising. Many people from his own district of Donegal had settled in western New Brunswick, particularly around Woodstock and further north at Florenceville. And soon after arriving in his new home, he headed for Florenceville, where, as he noted in his diary, he visited houses of a dozen distant relatives. Now, in Canada, he had the opportunity to do many things for the first time, and he records these in some detail in his diary. On the 7th of May, he crossed the border into the United States, and he wrote this in his diary: "First time on foreign soil." Isn't that interesting? On the 8th of July, he had ice cream for the first time. On the 23rd of July, he rowed a boat for the first time. Intriguingly, on the 3rd of October, he attended a Catholic church for the first time. Despite growing up in a majority Catholic county, it was not until he had crossed the Atlantic that he attended a Catholic place of worship. Now, Jack already had an interest in his family history even before emigrating, but now in his new home, he pursued it with some ardour. The visits to relatives provided opportunities to gather information. He used his spare time to construct family trees. He was very active and energetic for doing it for a number of years, until pressures of work in 1894 forced him to lay it to one side. On the 15th November 1886, he heard some worrying news from home. A letter had arrived from his mother relating that his father had suffered an attack of angina. He immediately cabled home, "How is father?" Word came back, "Well." Just over a fortnight later, he received a letter from his father reassuring him as to the state of his health. Andrew Elder was not well, however, and he died on the 20th of December. At 5 p.m. that day, Jack heard the fateful news. He had once booked a passage on the Sarnia, sailing from Portland, Maine. He headed for there and departed on the 23rd of December. Christmas Day was spent in Halifax, and from then onwards it was a straightforward voyage back to Moville, arriving on the 3rd of January. He arrived at 9:30, was in Derry by noon, was home at Ashgrove that evening. He spent a few months at home sorting out his father's estate and the farm, but in early April 1887 he again made plans to return to Canada. This would be his third transatlantic voyage. He booked a passage, this time by steerage, on the steamship Sardinian. This cost him £4, 14 shillings and 5 pence, although he got 4 shillings discount. He and his brother Andy, who accompanied him, were two of the 985 passengers on that ship, collected from Moville not all of them collected from Moville, but they were collected from Moville on the 15th of April, almost a year since his first voyage. From the summer of 1891, Jack had been working for the firm of William Scott and Co. in Indianapolis. Scott was himself a native of Donegal. He was from Newton Cunningham. However, by autumn 1893, the firm was going out of business, and Jack was given his notice, finishing on the 31st of October 1893. The very next day, he set out for home, travelling from Indianapolis to Montreal, from Montreal to Liverpool on the Lake Superior. While in Montreal, he met a young man he failed to recognise at first. It was his younger brother, whom he had not seen for 6.5 years. Now, having been made redundant, Jack did not have a lot of money to spare, even on a steerage ticket. In fact, on this voyage, he signed on as a cattleman. He was paid £1 10 shillings for the voyage to Liverpool. His designated role was as an assistant fireman in charge of a dozen cows. The opportunity to travel not just for free, but to actually get paid for it, was something that was availed of by many young men at this time. In fact, the night watchman on that voyage was a nephew of the Duke of Newcastle. The ship arrived in Liverpool on the 20th of November. The next day, Jack received his wages as a cattleman, but immediately handed this money over to the foreman on the voyage, on the ship. As he admitted himself in his diary, "I did no work. In fact, I did not even see the cattle during the voyage." He did not make his way to Donegal immediately, but travelled on to Dublin, where on 3 successive days he sat in the Strangers' Gallery in the House of Commons. His real hope was that he would hear Gladstone speak. Gladstone was a hero to many Ulster Liberals because of his land reforms. However, it was only in his third visit that he finally heard the grand old man address the House. On the 27th of November, he left London, travelled to Liverpool, then to Dublin, then north to home. There, waiting for him when he arrived at Ashgrove, was his sister Jeanie and her 4 children, whom he met for the first time. A fortnight after arriving in Donegal, he received a cablegram from Indianapolis, which read simply, "Elder, Castlefin, Ireland, March." And he understood that to mean he was not required back in the US for his new job before the spring. Knowing that he would be in Derry for several months, he made inquiries in Derry for a house to rent. And subsequently, he agreed to take, towards the end of December, he agreed to take number 6 Rosemount Terrace. That was later changed to number 7 when he discovered that someone had died of tuberculosis in number 6. His sojourn in Derry was only ever meant to have been temporary. On the 16th of February 1894, he bought a ticket for a passage on the SS State of California. The fare, including the onward journey by rail to Baltimore, cost him £7, 12 shillings and 1 pence. Before setting out the next day, he engaged in another of those eve of departure rituals. He had a photograph taken with his mother, his brother Stuart, and his sister Isa at the Glass Studio in Derry. At 6 p.m. that evening, he boarded the tender Albatross at Derry for Moville. Several of his closest friends and family were at the wharf to see him off, but on this occasion, his brother Stuart travelled with him as far as Moville to say goodbye. Less than a fortnight later, his ship arrived in New York. Now, there was no particular rush to reach his final destination, and happily meandered across eastern United States, stopping at Princeton and then Philadelphia before going on to Washington, D.C., visiting the Capitol and the White House. He recorded in his diary, "Was at the White House and saw the President and Mrs. Cleveland driving. I was the only one in the grounds as they passed. Mrs. Cleveland bowed, and the President raised his hat in response to a similar action on my part." Couldn't imagine that happening now. From Washington, he travelled on to Louisville, and from there to Indianapolis, arriving 11 days after landing at New York. Although the record of his diary that we have stops in 1898, we know that Jack made at least one further journey back to Ireland in the summer of 1900. We knew nothing of the eastward journey, but the return voyage was to Quebec on the Tunisian, and this time he travelled saloon, or top class. He paid something in the region of £9 to £13 for that voyage. Now, shortly after arriving back in North America, he moved to Toronto, which was to be his home for the rest of his life. He married there in 1905, and a daughter was born in 1906. In early 1910, he began working for the Toronto Star newspaper. He was a librarian and the editor of the Question and Answers feature. In 1927, after a gap of 33 years, he resumed his family history research. I know there are some keen genealogists here, but imagine laying down your research for 33 years. But then he resumed it with incredible passion and energy, and brought together his extensive investigations into a series of volumes which were circulated among family members. And here is the one that I have. This is John James Elder's Family Records book. Okay, it's hard to place a monetary value on it, but for me it's priceless, as it would be for any of you if you have something like that. In conclusion, the story of Jack Elder's transatlantic voyages is not spectacular. There were no shipwrecks or anything like that, no piracy. Yet, they provide an insight into the experiences of how our ancestors crossed the Atlantic in the late 19th century. And I hope it has answered some of the questions posed by the organisers in terms of how. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, William. You can see where genealogy is literally in his DNA. He didn't take it from the wall, as my mother said. It's in him recording, and also as well, just very conscious. There's no such thing as an ordinary story. It's exploring the migrant in us all. So thank you for the fascinating and personal insight into your family, and what a lovely way to end it, and to have that material culture of the book. Thank you, William. Next up we have Dr. Christina Ziegler-Mc Pherson, and I met Christina in Ljubljana in Slovenia, and we did some at the European Association of Migration Institutes, and she'd been a very good friend of the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies. Christina she's a US scholar working in Germany, and I think I have to almost give her probably a prize for the best title of a paper. I really like it when you think about it. She said, "You don't build your own boat, how multinational corporations decide where and how we migrate." And I thought, how true is that even today? You know, who really runs the world? And you know, even I have an own daughter working for a big corporation in London and going to Australia. You know, how does the world work? So it's a great title. I've only lately got hold of which I think is a wonderful book. Again, great title. Christina's book, Selling America, Immigration Promotion and the Settlement of the American Continent, 1607 to 1914. So that whole idea, so it ties very much in with the theme of the conference, the how. You know, how is it sold? Why did people go? And what William did. So I'd like to invite you to the podium, please, Christina.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'd like you to all think about how we got here. What form of transportation did we actually take to get here? Okay. So for me, because I'm very fortunate and I have an airport in my city, which is Bremen, I first, and you can take public transportation to the airport. So I took the streetcar, the tram, to the airport, and that was about 20 minutes. And from Bremen Airport, I flew to London Stansted on Ryanair, which is about 1 hour in the air. For non-Europeans, Ryanair is a large Irish discounter that is one of our main providers in Bremen. And so from Stansted to Liverpool Street Station, it's about an hour on train, and then from Liverpool Street out to Heathrow, that's another hour, and then from Heathrow, I flew British Airways to Belfast, and then in Belfast, I got on the bus to come out to Omagh, and that was about 2 hours. Okay, and then when I go home, I will again take the bus to Belfast, and then this time I'm flying KLM home because there are no direct flights from Belfast to Bremen. And so that means I have to make a stop in Amsterdam, but it's only about 45 minutes from Amsterdam to Bremen. So altogether, it's roughly about 6 hours from Bremen to here. You can say, oh, that's a lot of time, but I don't think that's too bad for 1,660 kilometers, or for Americans, 1,030 miles. And this gets to my main point, which is we do not build our own boat or plane, but are rather dependent on large corporations to transport us from place to place. And these corporations have their own interests. Trade routes and the business decisions of multinational transportation companies played a significant role in the migration of millions of immigrants to America in the 19th century, but have long been ignored or underappreciated by scholars. Instead, the primary narrative has been that individual agency, facilitated by family and community networks, determined how and where Europeans migrated. Yet few people have migrated by foot in the modern period, and therefore these migrants have been dependent on others to provide their transportation. And in the 19th century, this long-distance transportation meant steamships and railroads, the first modern multinational corporations. So today I'd like to argue that business strategies and changing technology influence migration patterns and therefore need to be factored into analysis of migration, especially for the 19th century. I compare British and German steamship companies, their routes, sales and business practices, and ask what role these business decisions played in shaping European migration to the US from the mid-19th century until World War I. I focus on both the large impersonal forces of market and industrial capitalism and the individual decisions of business executives in shaping transatlantic migration history. So some people always want to migrate. The question is whether they have the means to do so. And the questions that interest me are, what are those means of migration and who provides them? So passenger transportation was and is first and foremost a business. And how this business functions reflects the choices and decisions of its owners, managers, and to a lesser extent, shareholders and employees. Business decisions and strategies such as which ports would be used as basis of operation, routes, ticket prices, and what kinds of tickets influenced who could emigrate and where. Business owners and managers also reacted to new technological innovations such as steam power, the screw propeller, and the telegraph, which influenced the development of transportation industries. Yay. So transatlantic passenger transportation emerges as an industry distinct from freight shipping in the 1820s in response to a basic business problem, and that is a lack of enough westbound freight. Combination of high tariffs on agricultural and manufactured goods exported to the new United States, and the U.S.'s large export of raw commodity goods, particularly tobacco and then cotton to Europe, meant that Europeans faced the problem of sailing, or European ships faced the problem of sailing to America with empty cargo holds. The solution was to modify the cargo ship to create larger passenger spaces, the so-called between deck or steerage space. Now, migrants have, of course, long been transported in between cargo spaces, but as the demand for transatlantic passenger service increased, companies that transported primarily or even exclusively passengers only emerged. Ticket agents and passenger brokerage firms also emerged as related industries, first in Great Britain and Ireland in the 1820s, and then in the German states in the 1830s. British shippers also pioneered the prepaid ticket system or remittance system in the 1820s, which further enabled would-be emigrants to travel. The great technological innovation in this period in passenger transportation was, of course, steam. Although we'd had steam-powered boats and ships on rivers, channels, and smaller seas in the late 18-teens, it was not until the late 1830s, early 1840s, that steam begins to regularly be used to power transatlantic ships. Running slightly parallel to this technological development was the development of steam-powered railroads, beginning in the 18-teens in Great Britain. By the 1850s, railroad companies on both sides of the Atlantic had begun to connect their lines to ocean ports and set train schedules according to the sailing schedules of steamship companies. By the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s, transatlantic telegraph communications had been established between Great Britain and North America, which shortened communication time from weeks to minutes. Now, the British pioneered steam-powered transportation on both sides of the Atlantic, on both land and sea, and there are several important steamship companies that are founded between 1830s and the 1850s. So you have Cunard in 1839, initially as the British and North American Steam Packet Company, the Wilson Line in 1843, White Star in 1845, Inman in 1850, the Allen Line in 1854 as initially the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company, and the Anchor Line in 1855, and his first sails to New York beginning in 1857. German companies followed, with Hamburg America Packet Company being founded as a transatlantic sailing ship company in 1847, and North German Lloyd as a passenger steamship company in 1857. That same year, Hapag converted its fleet to steam. North German Lloyd engaged exclusively in passenger transportation, whereas Hapag carried both passengers and freight. Newly organized steamship companies and reorganized sailing ship companies, now using steam power, followed long-established trade routes between Great Britain and North America, the primary ones being between the English port of Liverpool and the American ports of New York and Philadelphia. In the 1850s, Le Havre in France, Bremen, and Hamburg became important European ports catering to emigrant traffic. By the end of the 19th century, as a third wave of mass migration was beginning, Southampton had replaced Liverpool as the main passenger port for the UK, and Baltimore, New Orleans, and Boston had long replaced Philadelphia as major passenger ports. New York surpassed Philadelphia as the U.S. primary passenger and freight port by 1800 and remained dominant for the rest of the 19th century. It's important to note that theoretically, the new technology of steam power and its corresponding ability to sail against wind and currents meant that shipping companies did not have to follow pre-existing routes the sailing ship companies had developed in reaction to environmental factors. Yet steamship companies did follow these same routes, and they sailed to and from the same ports sailing ships had sailed. This was due to the infrastructure the companies had developed on both sides of the Atlantic and passengers' expectations, which had been previously set by transportation companies in the sailing ship period. Sorry, I have a nice picture of people leaving Queenstown. So although Irish ports, particularly Queenstown, Cork, now Cove, Londonderry, Waterford, had been deeply connected to the larger British trade system with North America, and these business connections in turn facilitated migration from Ulster in the early 19th century, there was a shift in routes. First from Irish ports to Liverpool, and then from Philadelphia to New York. Increasingly, Irish immigrants traveled first east to Liverpool and then sailed from Liverpool to New York. By 1836, nearly 90% of the Irish immigrants arriving in New York City had departed from Liverpool. And this was due to the fact that Liverpool had become a hub for passenger steamship companies to which British railroads were connecting themselves. These emigrants traveling from Liverpool had a lot of choice. They could sail with the Dominion Line and the Allen Line, which sailed to Quebec and Montreal, the National Steam Navigation Company, Inman, Cunard, and White Star, which sailed to New York. And choice meant competitive pricing and competitive accommodation standards. Although Cork is geographically closer to North America than Liverpool, it failed to develop into a major emigration port in the 19th century because trade connections dominated and determined emigration routes. And Liverpool had become the largest port for U.S. imports by the 1840s. Liverpool was the main departure port for most UK and Ireland passenger transportation for most of the 19th century until the 1890s, when it was surpassed by Southampton. And this was only possible because Southampton aggressively courted the steamship lines by greatly expanding its facilities to accommodate the ever-growing size of passenger steamships. In 1899, 6 steamship lines sailed in and out of Southampton. The American Line, owned by the International Navigation Company, the Castle Line and Union Line, which both sailed to South Africa, the Royal Mail Steamship Company, which sailed to South America and the Caribbean, and North German Lloyd and Hapag. Southampton's triumph over Liverpool was complete in 1907 when the White Star Line moved its operations to Southampton. Displaced by Southampton in passenger transportation, Liverpool continued to be an important port for freight. Entering the transportation market relatively late in the 1850s, German steamship companies made little to no effort to compete with British lines for British or Irish passenger traffic, and instead concentrated on the large German lines and Eastern European markets. Occasionally, German lines attempted to compete with British companies for migration trade for Mediterranean ports, particularly Genoa. German passenger transportation followed English and British trade routes established in the 18th century, sailing first from German and French ports, Le Havre and Cherbourg, then to English ports, and then across the Atlantic before the development of steam allowed for more direct transatlantic sailing. By the time of the American Civil War, Hapag and North German Lloyd had emerged as dominant. So I'm going to quickly skip through some of these pretty pictures. So, in anticipation of greater American trade after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the city-state of Bremen built a new harbor at Bremerhaven close to the mouth of the Weser River on the North Sea in the late 1820s, and North German Lloyd began sailing between Bremerhaven and New York in 1858. In 1864, North German Lloyd built a pier on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River in Hoboken across from Manhattan. Although NDL never carried tobacco or cotton, it nonetheless established bases in Baltimore in 1867 and New Orleans in 1869, cities that had long, close economic ties to Bremen, particularly in tobacco. Nordstrom and Lloyd added services to Galveston, Texas in 1884. Nordstrom and Lloyd also stopped at Plymouth and Cherbourg on its way to and from Bremen in the early 20th centuries. Hapag built its pier in Hoboken in 1863 and began sailing regularly from Hamburg to Hoboken, stopping in at Cuxhaven at the mouth of the Elbe River and then to Cherbourg and Southampton and sometimes Plymouth before sailing across the Atlantic. So I'm going to rush. I like this because it just shows the insane number of connection points. So an important part of the steamship company's business, which they managed through partnerships with ticket agencies, was negotiating deals with railroads for discount tickets to sell to immigrants along with their steamship tickets. The railroads competed amongst themselves to persuade the steamship companies to dock at or near their terminuses and to include transportation on their roads along with their steamship tickets. For steamship companies to be able to offer cheap transportation to western cities such as Chicago, Cincinnati, or St. Louis was an important selling point in the recruitment of immigrant customers and often a key area of competition among steamship companies. So by the late 19th century, passenger transportation had become a huge business and was subject to great volatility, especially in the area of prices. Price wars to attract more customers were common, and cheap tickets coupled with faster sailing times meant that circular migration was finally possible. To stabilize this market and to keep out smaller competitors, the large steamship companies created pools and cartels, which established quotas for passenger markets, set prices for kinds of tickets, and determined which companies would sail from which ports. All of these anti-competitive practices affected customer choice, which in the case of the German steamship companies increasingly influenced whether an individual would be able to travel at all. German and British companies created the first pool in 1886, in which Hamburg agreed to abandon a recently established service between Stettin, Göteborg, which is Norway, and New York, and gave up its plans to establish a steerage service from British ports. The British lines agreed to adjust their fares and limit their share of traffic through Hamburg. In 1892, Hamburg America, Nordstrom and Lloyd, the Belgian Red Star Line, and Holland America Line formed the North Atlantic Steamship Association, Noord-Atlantische Dampflinienverband, and DLV. And in this pool, the members set common prices and divided up the steerage market amongst themselves. Fares were set according to quality of vessel, and the share of business was allotted determining based on how much traffic each line had carried between 1882 and 1891. Each member was assigned to specific European ports to avoid competition. And in addition, the pool set maximum commissions for their agents, forbid unfair advertising against each other, and paid for a permanent secretary in Cologne to arbitrate disputes. Although this stabilized the Atlantic market, the four members only represented 35% of the transatlantic traffic, and Cunard, White Star, and the French line were free to set their own fares and create their own pool. So for the rest of the 1890s, you continue to have this pooling, this creation of these cartels, and this significantly begins to affect passenger transportation, particularly from Russia, at a period in which you start to have mass migration of primarily Eastern European Jews from Russia. And this issue of the pools and the cartels in particular, and people's ability or inability to access certain ports becomes an important issue in the 1890s. Hapag and Nordstrom and Lloyd in particular would only honor each other's tickets. If you had a ticket on another company's lines, you would have to exchange it. You could not travel with another company. And most importantly, the German steamship companies were given control of the border stations between Russia and Prussia. And so if you did not have the correct kind of ticket, you would not be able to travel to the port. And so this literally affected who could travel and who could not. The British company's recognition that Hapag and Norddeutsche Lloyd in effect controlled or owned the Russian market meant that that they never provided any kind of competitive service there. And then the German companies, for their part, never made any effort to transport British or Irish migrants. So these business practices and interests, in some instances, literally opened and closed doors for would-be migrants. So thank you very much. I want to... I lived in Hoboken for 9 years, and I only went to the island once, a long time ago.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's such a relevant piece of work and describing the how. I was just thinking, I mean, Ryanair and Aer Lingus, we're all very aware at the minute that there's a pending strikes in Aer Lingus, but you just think about corporations and how all that works and how relevant that is, and businesses still controlling things. And so absolutely fascinating insight into the world of business and who really runs things. It's quite interesting. So thank you very, very much. And sorry for, I feel like very school masterish putting up the signs. So I'd like to introduce next Professor Thomas Dan, as I think more known as Dan McKnight. We've only met lately. Dan is chair and professor at the University of Texas, a specialism in early American history, particularly prior to the Civil War. And he's going to focus on Maryland and that side of the coast. So, and it's great to have you involved because I know I think you're new to this, Dan, and we only met lately. So thank you very, very much. So welcome. I'd ask Dan to come forward, and I'll just I'll get up his PowerPoint here.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay, so see if I can use the clicker with this. This paper discusses the migration and settlement of Irish, Scottish, and Ulster Scots migrants to the eastern shore of Virginia and Maryland between about 1650 and 1750. Together, these individuals collectively comprised a community contemporaries called Scotch-Irish, despite their varied origins. In terms of historiography, the paper draws on the work of James G. Leyburn, Richard McMaster, Somerset County historian Clayton Torrance, Lois Green Carr, Rankin Sherling, and others. James Perry's argument that, as opposed to the interpretation of a chaotic and turbulent 17th century Virginia society that long dominated historiography, a stable and coherent society began to form on the eastern shore of Virginia between 1620 and 1660, has also been important. What drew me to this topic, other than an interest in the history and development of the colonial Chesapeake and its people, was an interest in the development of the Lower South and the colonial migrations along the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, which is shown here, from Virginia and Maryland, that helped produce Southern society. Eastern Shore families moving along this route played an important role and were some of the very earliest Ulster Scots to reach the British North American colonies. Somerset County was settled in the 1660s. It is located on what is known today as the Delmarva Peninsula, including parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Its earliest settlers moved north from Accomack and Northampton counties in Virginia. And so I'm not sure if this has a laser, but does that do anything? Yeah. So it's this region here from Virginia moving in. And this shows it in 1775, right in this area. That's where we'll be discussing. Some Scottish and Irish colonists appeared on the peninsula early on. Walter Scott established a plantation there by 1618, and by the 1670s, 3 generations of his family had lived there, including son-in-law William Ennis, a Somerset County justice, who was mentioned in the 1665 will of John Forsyth, along with Thomas Scott and George Frizzle, as my countrymen. The earliest specific reference I have found to Irish servants was 1665, and references become more common later in the century. Interestingly, some of these references included no surname, listing only the individual's given name, their years to serve, and their economic valuation. The next three slides, drawn from the work of John C. Lyon, show settlement patterns in Somerset based on colonial land grants and patents. At 25-year intervals, we can witness how the county filled from south to north, along the east and west coasts, along the riverways, and finally into the interior. By the time settlement reached this point, the best lands were taken and younger generations began to leave the eastern shore for other locations. This slide shows administrative districts called hundreds in Old Somerset. 2 additional counties were formed from Somerset, Worcester County in 1742 and Wicomico in 1867. There were 9 hundreds in Old Somerset, and over time, all 9 included Irish, Scottish, and Ulster Scots colonists, with 7 to 10 Presbyterian congregations located throughout the county. These maps, of course, will be familiar to everyone and show Ulster with the parts included in Northern Ireland in the pinkish orange color, and the parts within the Republic of Ireland shown in the green color. And among the areas that we know for sure some of these Maryland colonists came from, if I can get this to point, we know some were from around in here, and that's already been mentioned, one of those by Brian. This slide shows the grave of William Stevens, a wealthy Somerset planter and court justice. For those familiar with Presbyterian migration from Ireland to the Chesapeake, William Stevens' name will be a familiar one because he wrote the letter to the Lagan Presbytery that a few years later brought Francis McCamey, William Trail, Thomas Wilson, and Samuel Davis to Maryland. Stevens was not an Ulster Scot. In fact, he was not even Irish or Scottish, but was instead an Englishman from Buckinghamshire. When I first read the call for papers, I didn't really expect to be able to find much more about the early migration than others have written, and so planned to focus my paper more on the actual settlements and how they developed over time than the process of settlement. But I think I did, in fact, come up with a few new things, or at least manage to assemble some familiar facts into a somewhat new framework. The next 4 slides show images and transcriptions of colonial Maryland headright records. Headrights were grants of 50 acres of land issued for paying a person's transportation into the colony, and this system existed with minor variations in both Virginia and Maryland. Passenger lists of the 17th century southern colonies from anywhere are essentially unheard of, but I did run across something very close when looking for background information on some of these Ulster Scots settlers in Somerset County. These are 2 headright records that were filed to claim a total of 4,300 acres of land for the transportation of 86 headrights into the colony in 2 different voyages in 1679 and 1680. Those are the original documents. Of a ship called the Mary of Liverpool, owned by Thomas Pemberton Merchant and captained by John Walls. Rights to the land for those transported, about 35 to 50% of whom bore Irish, Scottish, or Ulster Scot names, were then transferred by Pemberton and Walls to 3 men, William Stevens, John Winder, and Thomas Walker, all of whom were Somerset court justices and business associates. This slide focuses on the Liverpool to Ireland trade. Thomas Pemberton seems to have been a relative of the better-known Liverpool merchant John Pemberton, who had extensive trading connections in the Chesapeake. John Walls was a ship's captain who also acted as a merchant and who later became a Liverpool town councillor. He was active on the Liverpool scene for several decades and conducted an extensive trade with Ireland, which prior to Liverpool's 18th century expansion was the city's primary trading partner. In 1665, more than 90% of Liverpool's shipments were sent to or received from Irish ports, and John Walls was active from that time into the 17th century, by which time Liverpool had emerged as a major port city. Importantly, when Liverpool first began to expand its trade beyond Ireland, it was with the Caribbean island colonies, and many Irish migrants were transported on Liverpool ships to the Caribbean as servants. Involvement in the Chesapeake trade seems to have begun in the 1670s and to have peaked about 1700, with more than 110 documented voyages between the Chesapeake and Liverpool throughout the 1680s and 1690s. Of these, more early ships sailed to and from Maryland and Virginia. Paul Clemens argues that in the 1670s and 1680s, Liverpool began to export substantial numbers of servants to the Chesapeake, so much so that it came to rival Bristol, with recruits drawn primarily from rural Lancashire and the ports of Dublin and Drogheda, where traders found men and women willing to abandon their farms and tenancies for life in the colonial salt-weed economy. Clemens documented 84 Liverpool ships sailing for Irish ports in 1672, and 270 in the peak year of 1699. Trade prior to 1680 had usually been limited to Dublin and Drogheda, but over the next 4 decades expanded north to Belfast, Carrickfergus, and especially Newry and Derry, and south to Waterford and Cork. This suggests that the movement of colonists from Ulster to the eastern shore was an extension of the movement of Irish servants to the Caribbean. Given the smallness and intimacy of Ulster society, a fact commented upon by Richard McMaster in his study of Scotch-Irish merchants, the Maryland migrants likely had family ties to those living in the Caribbean. This seems to be borne out by Chesapeake trading networks, as well as by the later travels of Francis McCamey himself. On the eastern shore, several of the Somerset County justices played a key role in bringing servants from Ulster to the eastern shore. William Stevens certainly dominated the process economically. The next 2 slides show tracts of land acquired by William Stevens between 1665 and 1687, mostly through patents based on head rights. Altogether, Stevens acquired at least 62,338 acres in Old Somerset, which would have been granted in return for the transportation of 1,246 individuals into the colony. These grants peaked between 1674 and 1683, when Stevens acquired about 50,000 of these acres. The next 4 slides focus on a man called David Brown, another Somerset justice, who was a contemporary and associate of William Stevens. Brown was a leading Somerset merchant who arrived in the colony from Glasgow in 1670. He was also a Presbyterian and had a close relationship with the Reverend Thomas Wilson. Brown graduated from the University of Glasgow in 1663 and may have spent time in Ulster before coming to Maryland in 1670. He and his brother-in-law Archibald Erskine had an extensive trading network on both sides of the Atlantic, and this may have played a role in recruiting the Irish laborers who came to Maryland during these years as headwrights. Brown owned considerable land in Somerset, but he was never as active in land acquisition, speculation, and development as Stevens. By the late 1670s, Brown was one of the senior Somerset justices and was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful men in Somerset County. He had business dealings with William Stevens, the senior Somerset justice, and probably the wealthiest man in Somerset, and it seems that Brown's mercantile relationships must have influenced the recruitment of servants and other migrants from the lowlands, Scotland, and Ulster, and possibly other parts of Ireland to the eastern shore during the 1670s and 80s. When Stevens died in 1687, Brown replaced him as Somerset's leading figure, and he prospered in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when a Protestant faction wrested control of the colony from the Catholic Calvert family. Brown was a leader of the Protestant Association. By 1691, he was a member of the Maryland Council, and by 1693, a justice of the provincial court. Brown was at his apex when he died in 1697, having held major offices in Somerset at the provincial level, as one of those whom historians Darrett and Anita Ruttman have called the cosmopolitan few. Evidence of his dominant role within the Ulster Scots community comes from Edward Randolph, Commissioner of Customs for all of British North America, and the Somerset County judicial records. Randolph complained in 1692 that Brown, along with Robert King, dominated illegal trade on the eastern shore that involved commerce with New England, Ireland, and Scotland. He cited at least 30 illegal ships that plied their trade from these locations in Somerset waters within the previous 5 years, commenting that hundreds of Scottish and Irish families had settled in Somerset, where they set up a linen factory over the past few years. Randolph alleged that Brown and King, whom he called a Scotch-Irish man, both support the interlopers, buy their cargoes, and govern the whole trade of the eastern shore. Additional confirmation of this comes from a 1689 judicial record, which I quote here, in which a man called Matthew Scarborough, who came from an older and better established Eastern Shore family, was accused of defaming David Brown, whom he did abuse and contemn, calling him rogue and dog, and in an appropriate manner styled him the Scotch-Irish man's God. Brown's will, probated in 1697, places him at the center of an extensive network that included members, you can't read it, but of the Ulster Scots community on the Eastern Shore, both key figures and poor servants, family members and business associates, and relations in Glasgow, and other prominent Eastern Shore figures. By this time, there were several hundred Ulster Scots families in Somerset, and Somerset tax records show that by the 1730s, their numbers had increased significantly. At least 7 Presbyterian churches then existed in Somerset, and others in neighboring counties of Virginia and Delaware. The groundwork for this migration seems to have been an extension of the Liverpool trading networks around the Irish Sea to the Caribbean, and by the 1670s and 1680s, the Eastern Shore. Overall, the substantial exodus from Ireland to the Chesapeake between about 1670 and 1700 suggests 3 further conclusions. The first is that, as it appears in the early Maryland records, the term Scotch-Irish may have referred to a combination of lowland Scots, Ulster settlers of all backgrounds, and other Protestant Irish on the Eastern Shore. Another is that, contrary to some views of Chesapeake migration that stress the random nature of transportation of servants and settlers, there may have been bonds of kinship and association among these immigrants that were transplanted across the Atlantic onto the Eastern Shore. Not only may recruitment have drawn consistently from the same towns and villages in Ireland, but Somerset records also show that individuals imported seem in most cases to have remained in the area for which lands were granted for their head rights. This suggests an ongoing relationship between Somerset on Maryland's Eastern Shore and the eastern coast of Ireland throughout the late 17th century. In addition, since this trade evolved from similar earlier patterns of trade with the British West Indies, Irish settlers on the Eastern Shore likely had familial ties to servants previously transported to the West Indies. Finally, in settling these individuals, William Stevens and his associates, like David Brown, may have been using them as laborers on granted lands, renting them lands directly, which they then cultivated on the basis of tenancy, using them as markets for imported goods, and enriching themselves by marketing items outside the Chesapeake that these settlers had produced. Stevens' extensive investments in land and head rights would have given him an economic interest in the socio-cultural welfare of these individuals, whose labor and rents were filling his coffers with profit, as would have Brown's commercial activities, both legal and illegal. Following Stevens' death in 1687, for more than a decade, a Scotch-Irish faction led by David Brown and Robert King dominated Somerset politically, economically, and socially. Instability in Maryland following the Glorious Revolution allowed men like David Brown to gain the upper hand, and the Ulster Scots settlements on the Eastern Shore became one of the earliest and largest Ulster Scots communities in the 17th century British North American colonies. This shows the 1689 declaration of support for the new Protestant king, and you can see from the names of some of those from Somerset who signed the influence of people I'm talking about. The next slides we'll go through very quickly, really for illustrative points, but this is 1742, the hundreds of Somerset before the creation of Worcester County in 1743. And these colonists lived in really all of these hundreds throughout the county, a heavy concentration here in the north. These are images of Francis McCamey. These are images of the McCamey Memorial. The next several are slides of images of Presbyterian churches in Somerset and also Accomack in Virginia. This is Rehoboth, one of the very earliest, Minokin, dating from 1683. McCamey Memorial, which was formerly Snow Hill Presbyterian Church. The historical markers at Rehoboth, Minokin, among the very earliest congregations. Borrowed from Rankin Shirling, but clerical migration, and you can see in the earliest period, the first 10 ministers came to the greater Delmarva region. And this dominated, up to the 1730s at least. Irish and Scottish place names, many of them from Ulster, quite a few from lowland Scotland, and then some from Southern Ireland as well that appear in the Somerset County record. So Southern Ireland, Waterford, Corkland, Kilkenny, Castlehaven, Irish Grove, but many townland designations from Ulster as well. And I identified, looking at the tax records, the wills, deeds, inventories, at least 150 surnames between 1680 and 1730 that indicate some sort of Irish, Scottish, or Ulster Scots heritage. These are the ones spelled with the M-A or M-A-C, McGee, Magoo, McGraw. These tend to have the M-C spelling, Mac, McCuddy, McFarlane, but of course it goes both ways. And then these are others that don't have the MC or MA, but names like Calhoun, Campbell, Kennedy, Carr, Cullen, Logan, Montgomery, Oliphant, O'Day, O'Dear, and then finally Ruark, Sullivan, Wallace, Wilson, Young, names like this. And the final slide just focusing on migration for illustrative purposes, but Lowland Scotland, Ulster, the Eastern Shore region, the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, and then the Lower South. And I actually come from the Lower South. I'm not from Appalachia, but I grew up on a road named Cameron Mill Road. The cemetery there where I'll be buried one day is the Moody Cemetery, named for the Moody family from Antrim. Our neighbors were the McCamey family, the Nelson family, the Delaney family, the Cameron family, which, interestingly, given some of the things that were discussed last night, were all African-American families, descendants of slaves who had belonged to Scotch-Irish colonists who came to that area in the 1830s. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that very comprehensive and all the research you've done. It's great to get the stuff from the 1600s as well, which sometimes isn't given enough prominence. We tend to think about 18th and 19th. So thank you very much for that. And as a Donegal man, thank you for giving McCamey a good plug there as well. So I'm that's very comprehensive. So thank you very, very much to our four presenters this morning. It is coffee time. The whole thrust and ethos of the conference is to kind of, be informal, and I think you can just interrogate them in your own time rather than have it afterwards. And I hope John Gilmore that there was a little bit about the Scotch-Irish there and some very definite references when they used the word. I know the late Michael Montgomery had written an awful lot about Scots-Irish, as if we haven't enough problems here with Northern Ireland, Ulster, north of Ireland. So anyway, it's coffee time, and look, I hope there's still plenty of coffee left. So a big thank you again to our four speakers for